Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us on Members Evening. So this evening we've got three speakers for you, and without any further ado, I think we'll go straight over to our first speaker, who's kindly agreed to talk this evening, which is Mark. Good evening, Mark.
Hello, Simon.
Well, thanks very much for joining us, and I think I need to apologise to all our viewers who've tuned in. I might have slightly misled them on the exhibition that's currently on at the Heritage Centre at the moment. But I think what I'll do, rather than mess around, I think I'll get straight over to you and get onto your presentation, if that's okay, Mark. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, the talk I'm going to give in a few moments is about the pirate attack on a Scarborough-built ship in the 1800s, and it's based on an exhibition that we did actually last year. It's not on at the moment. It finished at the end of last year. The current exhibition we've got on is about the borough engineer Harry Smith, and that is on until the end of March. So that's seems to be quite popular. So come down anytime, Wednesday to Sunday, 11 AM to 4 PM to see that, entrance free. And that will be followed in April of this year by the 110 years since the sinking of the Titanic and all the various connections that Scarborough has with the Titanic. So that's something to look forward to a bit later on in the year. But just to begin with this evening, the committee asked me if I would just briefly tell you about the Marine Drive project that we've been working on. Anybody that reads the Scarborough News will probably know that the Maritime Centre were awarded a National Heritage Lottery Fund grant.
SWB audio capture not registered.
2019, and then COVID came along, so it got delayed. But we've now been acknowledged and for that project. And the idea is to put somewhere about 30 information signs around the Marine Drive about Scarborough's history. As we live in such a fantastic place and we've got so much history to tell, it seemed a good idea to combine that with a lovely fresh air walk in the open air, especially post-COVID. All these ideas are very popular now. So we've basically going to have, as I say, about 30 signs, and that will cover most of the history, well, the most important parts, hopefully, of the history of Scarborough. The first seaside resort, the shipbuilding, the fishing, the early motor racing, a bit of football, the bombardment, but also going back to sort of dinosaurs, Vikings, cliff erosion, quite a few topics that have been actually chosen by a local school, several schools and colleges, and also the public. We've been asking people what they thought were the most interesting, important topics. So they will be, those topics will be very short piece of information about them. They won't be long information boards, they'll be quite short, and they'll be engraved in granite. So we won't have any of this problem of signs fading or people having trouble reading them, which happens with a lot of the larger signs we've noticed. And they'll be made to look a little bit like this on the right-hand side there, which is a porthole. And we came up with the idea of calling the project a porthole in time. So you look at these that look like portholes on ships, and you read a little bit of historic information, and hopefully learn
SWB audio capture not registered.
Around the 1.5 kilometres of the Marine Drive. There'll also be an application, an online app that you can link to, that will link to the Archaeological Society website, the Maritime website, to tell you more information if you want to learn it. And also there'll be a lot of public outreach in the cafes and the hotels, and some of the visitor attractions. We'll be doing surveying public about their memories of Scarborough, what they remember from their childhood, if they've got any family connections, historic connections going back with the fishing industry or the tourist industry. So it's a three-pronged project: the signs, the outreach work, and the application. So we hope to deliver all that this year, by the end of the year. If you're interested, want to get involved, email us at scarboroughmaritime@yahoo.com. We'll happily include you in that. And I can certainly update you as the project goes along. For the moment, we've got the telephone box on the left that some of you may have seen, which is down on Sandside, outside the Lancaster Inn. And it's the last red telephone box down on the seafront that we converted into a mini museum a couple of years ago now. So it's got a little audio commentary in there. And the light comes on when you open the door. So there's a little bit about Scarborough's maritime history in there as well. So that's there for now. And then hopefully in a year's time, we'll have the Marine Drive trail as well. So that's just a little bit of information about all that. Hopefully most of you will know the Maritime Centre down on Eastborough, 45 Eastborough. We've been running for about 10 years now. Okay, well, that's a sort of introduction to that. So I'll now move on to the main talk of the evening,
audio capture, not registered.
About a ship that was built in Scarborough. Many of you will recognise this picture. It's the 1725 print. And what's marvellous about it is you can see the ships that were probably built by the Scarborough yards. There were nearly 12 shipyards along the Sandside seafront there in the 17 and 1800s. And as you can see from the picture, they literally built the ships right on the sand and just formed them, the hull, and then waited for a high tide and pushed them out. So Tyndall's Yard was the biggest producer of ships, but as I say, there are about another 11 yards. And over 400 ships were built in Scarborough. So it was a busy port and an important port as well. So this story is about one particular ship called the Morning Star. So on February the 19th, 1828, a Scarborough-built ship, the Morning Star, was attacked by pirates. The ship had been at sea for 3 months and had women, children, and wounded soldiers on board. It was also carrying coffee, spices, ebony, and, unknown to the passengers on board, it contained chests full of treasure, looted by the British Army from the royal family in Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka. Tyndall's shipyard was established in 1653 and employed Quaker craftsmen. The Morning Star was built in 1823, and she was a 2-deck, 3-masted cargo-carrying bark of 345 tons. She was 93 feet long
audio capture,
and 24
not registered.
feet across, and was built of Malabar teak from India. She had cabin accommodation for her master, first mate, and 2 passengers. She was launched from her construction cradle on the sand, which was built in a trench dug at low tide. So this isn't actually a picture of the Morning Star, but it's a very similar bark vessel that was built in Scarborough. Many were with this size and shape, fairly sizable vessels. And as probably many of you know, one of the Scarborough-built ships took convicts to Australia in the First and Second Fleet. So there were pretty impressive, very solid vessels that sailed the world. So the Morning Star's second voyage began from Gravesend in Kent, where she was chartered by the Navy to bring home wounded soldiers from Ceylon. There was a war going on in Ceylon at that time. She would be unarmed and had to sail in protected convoys only. On a cold grey day in March 1827, they set sail for Madeira. And you can see in the slide here, Tyndall's Corner down on the Thames. They loaded wine and water in Madeira, then headed for the equator, another 2-month journey of 8,000 miles, arriving in Cape Town. In November, they finally arrived in Colombo in Ceylon. There they loaded the passengers, the wounded soldiers, the hidden treasure chests, and the ebony and the coffee, and set sail for England in December 1827. After leaving Ceylon, the ship stopped off in Cape Town to join up with a convoy of well-armed East India Company vessels.
SWB
A
audio
Royal
capture
Navy ship
not
also
registered.
escorted the convoy. Unfortunately, the Morning Star was a very slow ship when she was fully loaded and could only achieve about 4 knots. As they approached St. Helena, about 1,000 miles off the coast of Africa, they were trailing behind the East India ships, which rushed onwards at a grand 10 knots, hurrying to get their own goods back to London. The Navy escort would later be accused of staying with the more valuable East India ships. As the convoy disappeared over the horizon, they noticed a ship gaining on the Morning Star. They thought it could be a pirate ship, but took no action to slow down or go back. The Morning Star had also spotted the vessel, but could not put into port at St. Helena due to bad weather, so they ploughed on. Anne Logie, wife of Major William Logie, the senior army officer on board the Morning Star, was nursing her baby daughter when she heard 3 loud cannon blasts. They had come from the approaching pirate ship. The Morning Star, being a Quaker-built vessel and run by Quakers, had no cannons to fire back, so they had to hove to or be destroyed by enemy fire. The pirates demanded that the captain be sent over, but he only sent the second mate. The pirates gave him a good seeing to and returned him back in the boat and said if they didn't send the captain, they would sink the ship. And as you can see from this sketch, they obviously did more damage to the sails and the rigging. Captain Thomas Gibbs of the
SWB
Morning
audio
Star
capture
went over,
not registered.
whilst other pirates crossed back to the Morning Star. The rough-looking pistol and cutlass-wielding men frightened all the women, who ran into the captain's cabin and barricaded themselves in. The pirates soon discovered the treasure on board and made the crew row it across to their ship. They also found crates of Madeira wine and began drinking. One pirate, called Barbazon, hammered on the door where the women hid and demanded entry. Anne Logie told the women not to resist, as it would only end in more bloodshed. The pirates broke in and had their evil way with the women. The rest of the crew were locked in the hold. Benito de Soto was the captain of the pirate ship. He was a notorious, ruthless, bloodthirsty pirate blamed for many slaughters on attacked ships. He used the famous logic, dead men tell no tales. At 10 p.m, Benito ordered the pirates to kill all those on board and return back. However, the pirates on board were very drunk, so the pirate's carpenter decided it was easier to drill holes in the vessel and to let it sink with all on board. The raiders then returned to Benito's ship. Benito ordered Barbazan to kill Captain Gibbs and the first mate by shooting them in the head. The 2 young crew members and an old soldier who had rowed over the treasure were also killed. Then Benito, believing the Morning Star was sinking, set sail. After the pirates had gone, the women realized their ship was sinking.
SWB audio capture not registered.
And released the crew from the hold. They plugged the holes and began pumping out the water and throwing the heavy ebony wood and coffee sacks overboard. It took several days for the ship to become manageable. Fortunately, they were spotted by another British ship passing by, and with their help, they managed to patch up the rigging and sails and head for home. They made it back to England in April 1828. The East India Company and the Admiralty blamed the attack on Captain Gibbs for having no weapons on board with which to defend himself. Over 1,400 ships and 19,000 men had been lost in the early 1800s to piracy. A public outcry forced the government to declare a hunt for Benito de Soto. A few months later, Benito himself was shipwrecked in a storm near Cadiz in southern Spain. He managed to unload his treasure and tried to sell the wreck of the ship on, but a government official sensed something was not right about this captain and his story. Benito made a run for it and escaped to Gibraltar, where he used a false identity to enter the British-controlled town. There, he made contacts to try and sell on some of his stolen cargo. In Cadiz, the authorities arrested the rest of the crew, the pirate crew, and interviewed them. Many of their stories did not match, and the pirate Barbazan, seeking to save his own life, confessed their story in full. Their trial took place in December 1829. 6 of them were hung and quartered. The others were imprisoned.
SWB audio capture,
you can actually
not
see
registered.
Pictures of the pirates. Amazing they could write, really, and pictures of them hanging. In Gibraltar, Benito was arrested based on his false identity papers. He was wearing a pair of boots with the initials FG on them. These turned out to be Frank Goodwin's boots, one of the men who'd been on the Morning Star. The signed confession of Barbazan that had been taken by the Spanish authorities could sadly not be used in evidence at the British court in Gibraltar because it had been taken by the Spanish. The Admiralty sent 3 survivors from the Morning Star from Britain back to Gibraltar. These men faced a lineup of 10 unknown men, one of whom was Benito, but sadly they failed to pick him out. Benito still denied his part in the attacks. In January 1839, a new court trial was held, and one of the British witnesses then swore on oath that the figure, gait, and general appearance of the prisoner was the same as that of the pirate who attacked the Morning Star. This would not usually be enough evidence to get a conviction, but the items of clothing Benito had on him from the raided ship were stronger evidence and swayed the jury. Benito was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hung on the 25th of January, 1840, aged 26, after two years after the rape, pillage and murder aboard the Morning Star. The Tyndall shipbuilders later changed their policy on carrying cannons to defend themselves, but were then shunned by many other Quakers in Scarborough.
SWB audio capture, not registered.
If the true details about this case had ever got out. The British Navy supposedly ruled the high seas, so the loss of an extremely valuable cargo and the rape of British women should never have occurred. The government's close links with the East India Company was reason enough to try and cover up the story and blame it all on Captain Gibbs. Benito had been hung with the least possible fuss, and Admiralty and court records from that time still omit many details about the whole incident. All sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Government cover-up of something, even today. And funnily enough, the stolen treasure from Ceylon was recovered 100 years later when a Spanish builder was digging in a garden in Galicia. And it turned out as that where it was Benito de Soto's home in Galicia. So I'd say he stayed in the garden. So that concludes the amazing story, really, of Benito and the Scarborough-built ship, the Morning Star. I think it's very interesting, especially I'll show you the book there. All the information comes from this book by Michael Ford, who wrote it. He was researching his family history. He has an ancestor who was a Quaker and a sailor. And although he wasn't on the Morning Star, when he was researching his ancestors' details, he came across this story and followed it up and wrote this amazing book. I think it's on sale on Amazon. Just to finish off the whole story, I thought I would show you this map. It's from 2009, but it shows you pirate attacks around the world in 2009. So they're still going on even today. So we're lucky in Scarborough, we don't get them here anymore, but nevertheless, it's
SWB audio capture,
so I hope you've
not
enjoyed
registered.
that, and come down and see our exhibition about the Harry Smith and the Titanic later in the year. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. That was really interesting, and I think it's also very typical of the sort of exhibitions that you put on at the centre, isn't it? The sort of the level of detail and things that people can just come in and enjoy the sort of like the research that you and your volunteers have done there and put on. And then, let's say with Harry Smith on at the moment, it's certainly well worth a visit down to the centre, isn't it? Okay, well, thank you to Mark for that. And so what we'll do now, John Toy, the member, has prepared for us a short talk. So what we'll do is we'll just play that out for you now. So, to John.
Good evening. I'm ready to give a little talk here, which I'm a little hesitant about because it's rather an amateurish affair, done during the lockdown when I was shut in the flat and only had my relics of books, which I had left out of my big library, that all I had with me in the flat. And they were a copy of the Domesday Book and the 3 Pevsner volumes on Yorkshire. So what I decided to do, which I'm going to present to you, is to go through all the Domesday Yorkshire entry, noting down where the entry says there was a priest and a church. And then to go through all the Pevsner volumes to see where there were Anglo-Saxon remains, either in the church itself, integrated into the building, or on the floor for display, or outside the church in the churchyard. So that's what I've done, and I'm prepared to give you the results near Scarborough now. It was, of course, a two-way talk, and the Domesday Book is notoriously a problem when it comes to when it mentions churches and when it doesn't mention churches. It's a well-discussed problem for those of you who know about the Domesday Book. I have left out the West writing completely for this little talk and concentrated on the North and East writings in the Pevsner volumes. So to go back to Domesday, Domesday gives over 50 churches in the 2 writings, but of course that's a minimal. We know there were many more than that. There are other sources, of course, which tell us a lot, mainly archaeology ones. And we know that there were many more, so that when Domesday says there was a church there, we can be pretty sure that in 1086 there were churches in those villages. But when it doesn't say there was a church there, it doesn't mean there wasn't one. We know, for example, that at places like Lastingham and Kirkdale were bound to be churches, but they're not mentioned in Domesday. Domesday, of course, was not interested primarily in churches. It was about land ownership and taxation possibilities for the king. And that was its main concentration. And it may have been that when they do mention churches, they were churches that had some land attached to them. We know that only a few decades later, there was a church council insisting that when any new church was built, it had to have land attached to it. And that shows that there were quite a lot of churches that hadn't had land. So we go to Domesday now, and the nearest churches to Scarborough were Seymour. It mentions Seymour Church, well, not of course anything to do with the present church, but what was there before in 1086. It then also, of course, mentions Hackness, which was a major ecclesiastical centre for the whole of this region. Unusually, Domesday says that Hackness has 3 churches and 3 priests. So that was obviously the monastery refounded again after the Danish disruptions. And maybe it included 1 or 2 of the surrounding villages in those 3 churches, but we don't know. The next one nearest to us was Brompton by Swordswood. Again, that wasn't the present church in any way, but it was what was there before in 1086. And then the 4th one nearby is Hunmerby, which is mentioned again. That does have some Anglo-Saxon remains in it, built into the side wall, but that may have been what Domesday was talking about. If we go a bit further in the writings, I'll mention a few others further away: Garton on the Wolds, Foston on the Wolds, Bishop Wilton, Water, Crome, Barton the Street, Old Malton, Kirkby Moorside, Kirkham, Bulmer, Bainton, and of course Bridlington. The Bridlington monastery, of course, had been founded in Anglo-Saxon times, and obviously was still in some kind of existence in 1086. Well, that's the Domesday for the nearby areas, but of course there's a lot of interesting in the other ridings, the other parts of the riding and of West Riding, but I have to leave that now. I turn to the other prong of my little research, which was Pevsner. Where does he say Anglo-Saxon remains are in the church or outside the church? Well, Hackness, obviously. Hackness is quite clear that that was a major place in 1086. Tiley is mentioned, and Folkestone, nearby here. Those are the nearest to Scarborough. Kirkby Misterton, it mentions, Kirkdale, Thornton le Dale, Hovingham, Nunnington, Sherburn, Lowthorpe, and of course Little Driffield. Not Great Driffield, but Little Driffield, it mentions as having a church in 1080, as having Anglo-Saxon remains in that time. So we can presume there were Anglo-Saxon churches there. But of course, we do know from many other sources that there were hundreds of churches all around Yorkshire at this time. The Danes, of course, had done a lot of damage centuries earlier. Whether the harrying of the north by William the Conqueror really made much difference to village churches, we're very uncertain. It seems that it was less affair nowadays than it was formerly thought to be, and they may have only done damage in the major cities like York and possibly Lincoln. But the harrying of the north doesn't seem to play such a part in the destruction of Anglo-Saxon churches, and there must have been a large number of them. Whether they were all wooden, I very much doubt, because the Anglo-Saxon stone carvings are stone, and if they were stone carvings for crosses and things, they may well have been white churches, as they were called. built of stone. At least some of the ones I've enumerated could well have been stone buildings. I think that's really about all I've got to tell you about my little research, but I hope it's of some interest to some of you. Anyway, it's been of great interest to me, and I'm still working on the results of Yorkshire. Thank you very much for listening.
My talk this evening is on a topic that I've been researching for many years, going back 20 years or so. And in fact, I've just been reminded, I did give a talk in the library to the Society on this topic in the early years of this century. But I'm doing it slightly differently this evening, because the more I research war memorials, the more I discover that there's a huge amount to be found out. So I want to enlist help with this. I started off researching the war memorials of Scarborough and district. I'm now focusing on the First World War memorials of the whole of Yorkshire. And that's a pretty big topic. When in December 1920, the Bishop of Sheffield dedicated a war memorial in the parish church of Mexborough near Doncaster, shown in this image, he said that he'd already performed similar ceremonies at least 100 times. And he predicted that the whole of Britain would be covered with war memorials. They would number 40 or 50,000. And in fact, I've studied so far about 500 Yorkshire settlements, ranging from very small villages through to very large towns and cities, many of them with more than one war memorial. And in fact, there are now, as the bishop had predicted, well over 50,000 war memorials in this country. Estimates vary. It may be as high as 70,000. But I want to start this evening by getting you thinking about types of war memorial. The example here is from Long Riston near Hull. And in many ways, it's a pretty archetypal war memorial. It has a base, it has a cross, it has a list of names, and it has a motto at the bottom. And that's very much your archetypal First World War memorial. But this is also a war memorial. It's Castle Crag in Borrowdale. If you go from Keswick down to the lake and walk along to Friars Crag and look up, you see Castle Crag at the other end of Derwentwater. And it is a war memorial with, at the top near it, the summit cairn. And here's me photographed by Pete Beecroft many years ago, an actual war memorial on it to mark it as a war memorial. But of course, war memorials vary enormously. Lots of them from the First World War are rolls of honour, though this one in Scarborough Town Hall is a reminder that the First World War didn't mark the beginning of war memorials in this country, far from it. This is a war memorial to the South African War at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. At SEMA, they went for a utilitarian war memorial, because war memorials are either something that is simply to commemorate or they're utilitarian. And if you look there, you'll see this: SEMA and Ayrton War Memorial to those who fell in the Great War. There's another one, by the way, at Old Malton, very similar. In Pickering, the War Memorial Hall, with its plaque on the side, was the conversion of an old mill. At Whitby, they built a War Memorial Hospital, and the current hospital at Whitby stands on its site. There was another war memorial at Hornsey, for example. At Castleton, a church was built, as a war memorial, inspired by the vicar. But lots of them are crosses. Here's the one from East and West Ayton. There are plenty of others, and notice the different designs: Burton Fleming and Easington, Flamborough and Ganton, Kirby Moorside, and the one outside St Martin's Church in Scarborough. The first memorial outside St Martin's was objected to by those who thought it was too high church, and it was set on fire, and it can now be seen inside. But they replaced that with a cross. Here's the one at Brompton, and notice you've got a different type of cross here. Much more of a Celtic cross. As at Staithes, Hutton Bushel, and this one, which is one of my favourites, at Kirkhamerton, between York and Harrogate. I haven't yet found in Yorkshire, though I know there are some, and I must get out to photograph them, a war memorial depicting a soldier. And this is one that friends took over the borders at Sladeburne in Lancashire. And there are some very famous war memorials in this country depicting soldiers in uniform, including the very famous one in Cambridge near the railway station, which shows the homecoming of a soldier. This one at Weaverthorpe is the only one of its type I've ever come across, a stone cross with a rifle depicted. Sledmere had two. The old memorial on the left, which was updated, the Eleanor Cross, to be a war memorial, and the Wagoners one on the right, which I'll be coming back to a bit later. And so I'm urging you to look out for war memorials. Some of them do take an obviously religious form. At the Church of St Hedder at Egton Bridge, there is this. At Lythe, this. And at Helmsley, this one. And this is unusual in that most ones in this form tend to be at Catholic churches, whereas the church here in Helmsley is Church of England. At Hackness, you've got a different one again. And you've got obelisks at Cloughton, at Folkestone, Flixton and Flotmanby, and elsewhere. At Bempton, stained glass, and stained glass war memorials are not uncommon. At Filey, you've got this magnificent gate to the Memorial Gardens. And you'll notice that this one is the men of 2 world wars. And again, I'll be coming back to that theme. So, different types of memorial. And you might want to think about, why did a particular place or a particular institution go for a certain type? But then there's also the question of, when were they constructed? Well, some were actually put up while the war was still in progress. Here's the unveiling of our war memorial on Oliver's Mount, and it dates from September 1923. So it was nearly 5 years after the armistice before Scarborough got its war memorial, or its town war memorial. There had already been others unveiled in Scarborough, just some examples. In 1920, the tablet at the Cricket Club on North Marine Road. 1920 again, the stained glass window at the Constitutional Club in Hunters Row, the building that's now having difficulties in its conversion to part of a hotel. The same time, November 1920, a window and tablet at Holy Trinity Church. 9th March 21, a tablet at the Jubilee Primitive Methodist Chapel. I just chose 4 examples of war memorials that were erected in Scarborough before the Oliver's Mount one. And this is part of what you find with many settlements, that it's not just one memorial for the settlement, but different groups have their own war memorials. And perhaps where a war memorial is delayed, it's partly because people are dividing their efforts. This, by the way, is the one that was in the Constitutional Club. Part of the problem in Scarborough, it was that nobody could decide what the memorial for the town ought to be, or where it ought to be. This is one of the ideas that was put forward, a temple in Valley Road, which never obviously didn't get built. All sorts of ideas were put forward. The newspapers were full of details and suggestions in letters, including one person who said, build the North Pier again as a war memorial. And then there's a matter of where do we find war memorials? Well, often they're in churches or they're part of the fabric of the churches. Here at Rillington, and I'm sure most, if not all of you, will have passed this church at some point on the A64, you have a porch erected by the vicar and his wife and their other sons in memory of one of their sons who'd been killed in the war. In St Mary's, we have war memorials, and this is the more usual thing in churches, to have plaques or tablets. Many war memorials, as at Muston and North Grimston, are in churchyards, church grounds. The one at Scarborough is. St Peter's doesn't have a churchyard as such in the sense of a grassy area, but St Peter's Roman Catholic Church in Scarborough has its war memorial right just outside the building, in effect at the side of the car park. At Wycombe, the plaque is on the outside of the wall that surrounds the churchyard. Dean Road Cemetery has the standard one created for cemeteries where soldiers were buried. In other places, they're in areas near to the road, as at Brompton, at Snainton, and notice some of these have surroundings, railings or other things to mark the areas off. This is one of my favourites. Simple design at Rudston, nice location, makes it highly visible, but as somebody I know commented on Twitter recently, rather marred by that speed sign. In Goathland, it's actually in a grassy area. In Bridlington, as in some other large towns and cities, in a special area in the town centre. This is Skipsea. At Staithes, it's at the top of the hill near the car park. At Cloughton, the war memorial is at the side of the road. And I have to tell you, it was very difficult to get this photograph from the other side of the road without being hit by traffic coming down the hill. But in fact, the original position in Cloughton was further down the road, down the hill, but it was moved. This again is one of my favourites. This is the one at Loftus, right in the middle of the small settlement, but set up high and very visible. And this is the one that has on the back of it a memorial to the local born Hollis, Stanley Hollis, the only man to win the VC on D-Day. So who put the memorials up? Now, if you're researching a war memorial, this is another key question. Who did it? Well, at Cloughton, it says erected by the inhabitants. Similarly, at Gristhorpe and Leverston. But it, of course, raises questions. Which inhabitants? Was it ordinary people, or did the leading figures in the local community take charge of the movement, or was it a mixture? At North Grimston, it's the parents of the deceased in the war, those killed in the war. At Egton Bridge, and I'm sorry, it's rather faint, but it is members of the congregation. At Helmsley, it's fellow servicemen from this particular unit who the survivors who had the memorial erected. But again, if you look at any war memorials and if you come across information, my address is at the end of this talk, please let me know. And then what happened when the war memorials were unveiled or dedicated? Well, at Pickering, a large crowd assembled. This was in April 1922, when the memorial tablet that I showed you earlier was unveiled, and the memorial hall dedicated to the use of the town. And quite often, a prominent military person would do this. This Lieutenant General Sir Ivan Maxey, the general officer commanding Northern Command, did a lot of these ceremonies and actually spoke very well. Notice you get a guard of honor. And this is him speaking from the steps of the Memorial Hall in Pickering, and you get some idea of the crowd that had gathered, which fills that rather narrow road. But then the Memorial Hall was formally opened a few days later, the following week, by the wife of one of the two men who had given the site for the hall, a disused mill. And again, that's significant. Who gives the site for a war memorial? Is it land owned by the town or village or city, or is it privately owned but given to the community? And the hall on this occasion was very soon crowded by about 800 people. So it's another popular event. And that's her on the steps at the event. But with war memorials, it's also important to study the inscriptions carefully. What appears on them? Well, in gratitude to the men of Bempton and Buckton who fell in the Great War, 1914 to 1919. Now, hang on a minute, 14 to 19. The earlier ones I've shown you said 14 to 18. But in fact, different communities interpreted the length of the war in different ways. From 1914 to 18, because of the armistice in November 1918. But of course, the war wasn't technically over till the peace treaties were signed, particularly for this country, the Treaty of Versailles with Germany in June 1919. So this is why some communities went for that date. Notice also what's said at the bottom. You've got the list of names, and then God and their country called them, but their names shall live. And there's a great variety of these inscriptions. But some of the memorials are for those who served, not just for those who died. So at Harwood Dale, they recognise service, not just death. But this, and this is in a church, it's the church at Wold Newton in the porch, is one of my absolute favourites. Look at the care taken here. Those whose names are in black served. Those whose names are in red served and were wounded. And the names in gold were those who served and were killed. I haven't come across another one quite like this, but it's a magnificent memorial. And it does have their regiments as well. And you will find with war memorials a huge amount of effort going to get the names right. And coming back to another South Yorkshire example, when they were working in early 1921 on the Swinton War Memorial, they appealed for people to write into the local paper, the South Yorkshire Times, sometimes referred to as the Mexborough and Swinton Times. They invited people to write in and suggest alterations or additions. And this is part of that process. But as I said, look carefully at what's inscribed there. Often, as at Brompton and Sworden at the top, there will be a biblical quotation, in this case from 1 Samuel. Harrogate, in the big cenotaph in the centre of Harrogate, uses a phrase that appears on many, "our glorious dead." At Hinderwell, "pass not this stone in sorrow but in pride, and live your lives as nobly as they died." And this is a different type of war memorial to any I've shown you so far. It's a clock tower. Many people didn't have their own clocks. They relied on public clocks. And here's one set up as a war memorial. Sometimes you get details in the inscriptions of who constructed it or designed it. This is from Oliver's Mount, the top one, erected by voluntary subscriptions, foundation stone laid in September 1922 and veiled September 1923. And of course, the great Harry W. Smith, who was mentioned earlier, was the designer of the war memorial. I think I actually got interested in war memorials because I was already researching Smith 20 years ago. In Whitby, on one of the ones in the Whitby cemetery, it actually tells you the name of the builders, T. Hill and Sons. But look at the list of names. This is the one at Willoughby. In other words, the one you see on the A64, from the A64, it's the one at Staxton in reality. Look at the list of names. 3 Millers. Are they related? Well, actually, they could only get some of the names on each side of the memorial. And if you go round it, you'll find that on the next part, there's another Miller, as well as 2 McLarens. And it makes you wonder, in these small communities, the extent to which people were related, whose names appear. And this very sad one in Holy Trinity, Micklegate in York, commemorates 4 brothers who had died before 1919, when their father died. And 3 of them, Oswald, Wilfred and Roger, were killed in the First World War. Edwin had already died in a point-to-point race before the war. And it's the daughter and sister who erects this. And whereas many memorials, most of them really, are put up by communities, sometimes it's by families. I'm not showing any gravestones tonight, individual gravestones, because they are also a form of war memorial. At Muston and at Skipsea, we're reminded that some of those who died as a result of the First World War died when it was finished, but they died of the wounds that they'd received. Now we come to the later history of the memorials, and I come back to this magnificent one at Sledmere, the Wagoners Memorial. Sir Mark Sykes had in effect recruited a lot of people who worked on his land into a special unit during the First World War, the Wagoners Reserve. And when this war memorial was put up to them, the designer, presumably at Sykes, on Sykes' instructions, told the story of the Wagoners. And I'll just show you a couple of panels. Here they are loading up their wagons or unloading, and here they are holding off what were described at the time as the Hun. And then the barbarities of the Hun. And the reason I've focused on this one is that in the late 1930s, there was a pretty big international incident as a result of this. The German ambassador in Britain, I think it was, when he discovered it, protested about this barbaric way in which the Germans were depicted. But of course, when we think of later history, we tend to think in terms of what did they do when there was a Second World War. I read a newspaper account today from 1921 of one of the South Yorkshire settlements, where a journalist commented that this settlement was so slow to erect a war memorial that it probably wouldn't be up until there was another war. Well, what do you do after there's another world war? And at Kilham, they amended it by adding this stone book, as it were, showing the Second World War dead. At Burniston, you can see you've got two actual parts to this. First World War dead, and then below a separate panel for Second. And when I took these pictures a few years ago, there were people still remembering their comrades who'd fallen in the Second World War. At Burton Agnes, where you've got the First World War listed, you've got the Second listed, and as has happened on other memorials, later wars as well. A soldier from Burton Agnes who died during the NATO operation in Bosnia in 1996. And of course, you get ones to soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. You also get some new war memorials, and this one was erected in Whitby as things were heading towards the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the war. Here it is in a very good situation. It's the only one I've ever seen with anti-seagull spikes on top, and the simple message, lest we forget. Now, where might you see information? Well, there's the memorials themselves, postcards are very useful, newspaper accounts incredibly so, War Memorial Committee records, but sadly, very hard to locate. And if anybody comes across any for any Yorkshire settlement, please let me know. Records of local government authorities, church records, of course, and often records kept by architects. The architect who designed that one at Weaverthorpe with the stone rifle on it was actually a famous York architect, and apparently the records of his practice survive in the Borthwick Institute in York, and when it's safe to do so, I'm going to go and look at them. There are also some excellent websites. Now, of course, with these talks being broadcast in the way they are, you can go back to them if you want to look at any of these details. But if you're searching for a war memorial, the War Memorials Register compiled by the Imperial War Museum and War Memorials Online are great, and I use them all the time. Some localities have people who've compiled lists. There's one for Barnsley, for example, that I've taken to show you, but there are other places in that area, Sheffield, Rotherham, Doncaster, which have websites. And there's also the War Memorials Trust, which is the charity which concerns itself with the maintenance and upkeep of war memorials. And I must admit, when I retired in the summer of 2012, I put part of my lump sum towards life membership of this charity, which does a great deal of good work. There are also published books. Our own John Grant was responsible for a flask of tea, which is in memory of those from Gladstone Road School who gave their lives in the First World War. There's a similar volume here for Helmsley. But as I come to the end of this brief talk, I'd like to draw your attention to this, a brilliant pamphlet published by the Borthwick Institute, Framing Grief, War Memorials and Public Commemoration in York, 1914 to 25. What I'm aiming to do for Yorkshire is what this writer, a York University student, I believe, did for York itself. And she does show the variety, or she refers to a variety of memorials in York. This is the City Memorial, which you find fairly close to the railway station, as also this one, of course, which is the one to the workers on the North Eastern Railway. I had an incredibly frustrating day when I took this picture. I went up onto the walls and then onto the grass to take a picture of this memorial, and the bus didn't move for half an hour. It transpired the driver was having his lunch. So I need to go back and take that whole site without the bus there. And then, of course, I've shown you one church one. Here's the one from St. Denis Warmgate in York. So I'm appealing for any ideas or information on any Yorkshire war memorials. Don't worry that I might already have it. And I can be contacted at that email address, secretary@sahs.org.uk. Thank you very much.